One of the many truths about Formula One is that drivers find their position in the pecking order very quickly. And with the popularity of the blockbuster Drive to Survive, fans now have a good perspective of the teams and each of their drivers. With teams having to give more priority to one driver most of the time, there can always be a bit of an issue with egos clashing. For instance, you can imagine how bad things can get when a team's second-string driver tries to win a race, and the team communicates that they should instead leave the position open to the first-string driver just because they're trying to maximise points. Heading into this season, it was pretty obvious that Sergio Chico Perez would maintain his position as a second-string driver at Red Bull. I mean, it's pretty much a given considering that Red Bull currently has Max Verstappen, the two-time defending Formula One world champion and one of the most fascinating drivers to ever step on the grid. The problem is that Red Bull is now treating Chico pretty badly, and he's starting to get fed up with it. Stick around, racing fans, because we're going to get right into the mud on this one. But first, be sure to give us a like, a subscribe, and a quick tap of the bell icon so you don't miss out on any breaking action. Thank you very much. Okay, so this year's Australian Grand Prix was definitely one for the books. With a record number of red flags and enough questions over the FIA's decision-making, there was enough drama to go round. However, Chico was one of the drivers to really get the short end of the stick. And the Mexican driver is definitely letting his feelings show that he is not happy with how things are going. In light of everything that's happened, it's worth examining the events that have led us to this point, as well as the possible breakup that could happen as Red Bull go further into this year. A year where many believe that Red Bull should be able to continue its run of dominance. As we said, the Australian Grand Prix was quite an interesting outing. However, the Red Bull team didn't have things all their own way, particularly with Chico. The Mexican driver had a forgettable qualifying session, and his practice session wasn't so great either, as he locked up and went off the track in his first and third turns. Considering that the same scenario played out in 2022, it's understandable that Chico would be angry and frustrated, and many have wondered whether this is a case of Red Bull deliberately trying to sabotage him, or if he might be the problem. If you recall, Perez has had his eye on the championship for a bit now. After his impressive win at last year's Monaco Grand Prix, the Mexican stated that he was willing and ready to make a championship fight. But ever since he made this statement, he appears to have fallen off the pecking order. And not just at Red Bull. Ferrari, Mercedes and Aston Martin have all stepped up their game, and Perez's recent struggles have made many people question whether he still has that spark. Still, despite the drop in form, Perez's fans have been wondering whether Red Bull has been sabotaging the driver deliberately. It's no secret that Perez's crash in Monaco raised eyebrows, particularly among those who claimed he had done so on purpose to slow down Max's lead. And with Max clearly being the lead driver for Red Bull and his family having a considerable amount of influence, it could be that the team has actively been trying to sabotage Chico with a much inferior car after upgrades were made to vehicles going into the new season. Heading into 2023, it was looking like Perez could be a legitimate threat to Max and his goal of making a three-peat, and he beat his teammate to the top of the podium when the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix came along. Then came Australia. All eyes were on Chico to continue his hot run of form, but as we all know, things didn't pan out the way he had hoped. Perez already had a bad start to the entire weekend, with his practice round starting late due to a suspension issue on his car. When he did get on the grid, it was one mistake after another. Perez went off the track several times and it seemed like he couldn't control his vehicle properly. He only managed to get 18 laps in the practice session. Chico reportedly complained during the practice session that he had been dealing with issues with his brakes. He also stated that his vehicle's balance seemed off and that he couldn't quite get a handle on it. As usual, the engineers said that they'd get to the root of the problem. Whether or not they did, things only got worse for Perez when the qualifying round came along. He beached his car on the third turn, getting it completely stuck in the gravel. This meant that he would have to start the race at the back of the grid, and even worse, from the pit lane, due to changes being made to the car all through the weekend. Already, Chico had made his feelings known about the car and its technical difficulties. In his post-qualifying interview, he said,
"Yeah, it's really hard to digest this one, to end up qualifying on the second braking zone. It's really disappointing."
When asked whether he had been able to speak with his team about the car and the changes that needed to be made, he also said this.
We have a bit of an understanding and we are confident that together as a team we will be able to.
Chico added that it would be tough to get points from the race itself, and in a way, he was right. When Sunday came along, he put up quite the fight, working his way through from the back of the grid. And even though he was lucky that the safety car was brought out on the first lap, which allowed him to catch up to the rest of the pack, it wasn't quite enough. It was too little too late for Chico as he finished the race in P5, definitely not the type of result he was hoping for, but from the back of the grid, not too shabby. Considering how everything played out, Perez was understandably livid at the entire race. In a post-race press conference, he lashed out, calling the race outcome unacceptable and especially criticising his team and saying that the issues with his car pretty much ruined what was supposed to be a solid weekend. Speaking further, Chico explained that the race was damage control as a finish at P5 was not what he was looking to achieve. Ever since Chico's statement, everyone's been chipping in with their 2 cents and talking about whether the Mexican driver really has what it takes to finally make a title run. Many believe that Chico is just as good as Verstappen and should be given a fair shot by Red Bull, while others have pointed out that he perhaps doesn't necessarily have the killer instinct that has made his teammate a 2-time world champion. The argument for the latter also seems to be confirmed by Verstappen's outing at the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. Despite starting the race at the back of the grid, Mad Max managed to fight his way to P2, just 1 spot behind Chico. And, according to many of Max's fans, he would have still been able to pull off an impressive comeback in Australia if the roles had been reversed and he was the one who had started at the back of the grid. Nevertheless, it is worth noting that the track in Australia is more challenging than most others. With fewer points to overtake, drivers that start at the back of the grid tend to have a more challenging time catching up. Even Chico's impressive comeback was primarily because of the many instances where the safety car had to be brought out. He earned points in the race, but fewer than he would have liked. But with the Australian GP itself being an infamously brutal track, Perez might have had a tougher mission to earn a P2 finish that Verstappen had to face in Saudi Arabia. It's going to be tough to see how things shape up for the Red Bull team at the moment. They're still leading the pack with 2 of the best drivers in the game, but if there's one thing you must have learned about Formula 1, it's the standings can change on a dime. Ferrari, Mercedes and Aston Martin have all upped their game significantly in the past season, and they will be looking to mount a challenge. If Perez feels like the guys at Red Bull aren't prioritising him enough, it could lead to some serious friction within the team. We've seen this play out before. In 2016, Mercedes was the team to beat, and they had Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg, 2 of the best drivers ever on their roster. However, while the drivers initially got along, things didn't necessarily work out between them as the egos clashed, and they seemed to be getting in each other's way. The parallels between both situations is pretty interesting. In 2016, Mercedes was also ahead of everyone in the pack, and they had the best drivers. Essentially, the team's only enemy was itself. And to be fair, I don't think that anyone necessarily handled it all that great. Just as well, Red Bull currently has the most dominant car on the grid and is blessed with 2 of the very best drivers out there. The team has now been put in a situation where it seems like the team's only enemy is itself. If they don't get their act together, things could go south really quickly. The tectonic shifts between Verstappen and Perez are already starting to show. And with the 2 of them poised to challenge each other for the championship this year, things could definitely escalate rather quickly. One thing is certain though, if a battle between the drivers were to ensue, Verstappen would definitely be the one to get the better treatment from Red Bull. And that's understandable, quite frankly. He's the best driver on the grid at the moment, and it would be entirely unreasonable for Red Bull not to want to make him happy. As for Chico, he would have to reach an entirely new level if he were to wrestle the championship away from his teammate. Besides that, he'd also need some help from the Formula 1 gods and pray that Verstappen suffers some sort of consistent mechanical failure. You also need to keep in mind that Red Bull has made contingencies by bringing back Daniel Ricciardo and setting him up as their third string driver. Essentially, the message has been made loud and clear. Only one man at Red Bull is untouchable, and that man is Max Verstappen. Nevertheless, Chico is definitely not the type of driver to back down easily. He seems to understand the situation and is determined to fight for his place on the grid, however long it takes. Whatever happens, it's safe to say we've got quite the battle to look out for. Tell us what you think in the comments below. Will Chico battle for the World Championship, or will he continue to struggle with car problems? Or will he end up on a completely different team by season's end? Well, that's bold, but we've said it anyway. Let us know what your prediction is. And until the next one, this has been F1 Racing Now, your inside track to all things F1.